I'm not exactly sure who had the idea first, but by the end of the day, we'd settled on a date for the trip. Although I'd gone camping many times, I'm almost certain that neither Sean nor Alex had ever been before. They joined the family later on in life, and my real father had passed away by then. He was the one who loved the outdoors. My stepfather, however, wasn't particularly fond of it. Don't get me wrong, he's a good man, but nature wasn't his thing. We made a list of supplies and followed it closely, making sure to pack the essentials, especially the 4 cases of beer, which were probably the most important. We packed everything up, ready to leave at the crack of dawn the next morning. As we set off, we had no idea what was coming, or how the trip would affect our relationship, a bond we once thought was unbreakable. The 3-hour drive was quiet and uneventful. I was relieved to see that the area was dry, as starting a fire was always tricky for me, and I knew neither Sean nor Alex had ever made a fire. I brought some lighter fluid just in case, though I never needed it. While I worked on the fire, Sean and Alex struggled with setting up the tent. They had learned how to pitch a tent from watching YouTube videos, and despite me getting the simplest one available, it still took them nearly an hour to get it up. By the time they finished, the fire was blazing. I had already buried the potatoes in the coals, prepped the steaks, and was well into my second beer. The steaks didn't take long to cook, and by dusk, we were sitting down to a satisfying meal. Afterward, the real camping experience began. I had deliberately chosen a remote spot, knowing we'd get louder once we started drinking. More importantly, I love making big bonfires and playing music loud, something you can't do when there are others nearby. That evening turned into a blast. We went through 2 cases of beer and didn't pass out until morning. It was exactly what I needed, and despite the hangover, I decided we'd be doing this more often. When I finally dragged myself out of the sleeping bag, it was well past noon. Sean and Alex were already awake, sitting near the cold fire, each holding a beer. They were glad to see me. I asked about the fire, and Sean mumbled something about not being able to relight it. I laughed and went to the edge of the woods to grab some wood. When I came back, I blew on the coals, and within minutes, the fire was roaring again. I then went to the creek to fetch some water. The look on their faces when I returned was priceless. Sean's mouth was hanging open, and Alex looked like he wanted to ask me how I did it. While waiting for the water to boil, I cooked a big breakfast of eggs and potatoes, and we ate with some coffee. After breakfast, I suggested we go fishing. We didn't get back to camp until almost nightfall, and unfortunately, no one had caught anything we could keep. But I could tell that Sean was feeling good from the beer. I cooked the rest of the steaks, and we finished off the beer. That evening was much quieter than the previous night. I didn't want to make a big fire, knowing it would be difficult to completely put it out before we left. Most of the night, we talked about trivial things like work and relationships. Around 2 a.m., we decided to go to bed, the effects of the alcohol finally wearing off. I don't remember much after that, except for Sean stumbling out of the tent to relieve himself. He had drunk more than Alex or me, and he kept tripping as he tried to get out of his sleeping bag. Eventually, he made it outside. I must have passed out just after that. The next thing I remember was the sunlight streaming through the trees. I urgently needed to pee, so I fumbled around to unzip the tent, trying not to wake the others. As I opened it, a strange, burning smell hit me. Something like charred meat. I thought one of the guys had started cooking early. I turned to check on Alex, but he was still asleep. It had to have been Sean, though he was terrible at cooking. I crawled out with a sarcastic comment, expecting to see him messing up breakfast, but what I saw instead made my blood run cold. The fire had burned out, and Sean was nowhere in sight. The dim morning light barely illuminated a large object lying near the coals. As I got closer, the smell hit me full force. Then it hit me what I was seeing. Sean was face down across one corner of the cold fire, unmoving. Without thinking, I grabbed his body and rolled it over. His skin was burned beyond recognition, and I started yelling for Alex. When he didn't answer right away, I ran into the tent and shook him awake. He was slow to react, but when I screamed, "Sean's dead!" in his face, he bolted upright and asked me to repeat myself. I pointed toward the remnants of the fire and what was left of Sean's body, now fully visible in the rising sun. Alex rushed out of the tent, and in one motion, came face to face with the charred remains of our brother. I stood behind him, eyes closed, as he dropped to his knees, wailing. The sound of his grief and the stench of burning flesh filled the air. It was worse than any nightmare I could have imagined. A cold breeze blew across me, and that's when I realized I'd wet myself. But at that moment, it didn't matter. Every second, the reality of what had happened became clearer, and I was terrified to confront it. I eventually crawled back into the tent, overwhelmed with emotion, and cried for who knows how long. I knew I needed to call 911, so I eventually did. The authorities arrived about half an hour later. When the coroner took Sean's body, I found the courage to leave the tent. Alex was speaking with some of the officers. The smell was still unbearable, and I started gagging, retreating back into the tent. Soon, another officer came in, and we talked about the events of the previous night. He left after a short while, and the other officers followed. I began to pack up camp as quickly as I could. Alex joined me without saying a word, and we worked silently. I wanted nothing more than to get out of there as fast as possible. Looking back, I realize I probably appeared detached, but I was the oldest, and I knew I had to notify the rest of the family. Telling our mom was the hardest part. She had always wanted a big family, but after Dad's passing, she thought that dream was over. Then she met my stepfather, and when he mentioned adoption, she was overjoyed. Sean and Alex had been adopted when they were in their early teens, and while boys their age were harder to place, Mom had fallen in love with them. I always considered them my brothers, and I knew they felt the same. In the weeks that followed, I stayed close to Mom, knowing how difficult Sean's loss was for her. But it was also the first time I noticed Alex watching me with a strange, questioning look. It was subtle at first, but as the weeks went on, more and more questions arose, questions I didn't want to confront. I always assumed Sean's death was an accident. He'd been more intoxicated than us. But when the autopsy results came back, certain things didn't add up. The bruises on Sean's back, for example. He had played rugby for years, and his skull was fractured. The doctor admitted that these injuries could have happened in a fire, but it didn't ease Alex's suspicions. No matter how hard I tried to convince him that now wasn't the time for conspiracy theories, he was convinced I had something to do with Sean's death. I can't speak for what Alex was feeling or thinking during that time. Grief is complicated, and no one can dictate how someone should handle it, especially in a situation like this. As for me, I have my own doubts. I've seen Alex and Sean argue more than once, though they stopped when I entered the room. I won't lie, I have my own suspicions, but now is not the time to let that divide us. Mom needs us both right now. If she finds out about the tension between Alex and me, it would break her heart, maybe even destroy her. So for now, I'm gonna try to bring us back together. For her, if not for Sean. I owe it to him. After all, Sean was my brother. This story was shared by my history teacher, Mr. K, during class. We live in Fairbanks, Alaska, a state well known for its abundant wilderness and outdoor activities like hiking, fishing, and hunting. One weekend, Mr. K decided to go on a solo camping trip with his dog, about 2 hours away from town, in a forested area popular with hunters. Mr. K found a good spot near his SUV and set up camp. He spent the day playing fetch with his dog, exploring the area, and relaxing by the campfire. As evening fell, he prepared to sleep in his tent. It was just him and his dog who shared the small space with him. For safety, he had brought along a hunting knife and a pistol. In the middle of the night, his dog started whining. Assuming it needed to relieve itself, Mr. K unzipped the tent. His dog bolted into the woods without hesitation, which struck him as unusual, leaving the tent flap open so his dog could return. Mr. K lay back down but stayed alert. Not long after, he heard faint footsteps approaching the tent. He froze, gripping his weapon tightly, and kept his eyes on the open tent entrance. Soon, he saw a figure, a thin, bony humanoid shape moving in an odd, almost animalistic way. It resembled a gorilla in movement but was unnervingly skeletal. Because of the darkness, he couldn't make out any clear details beyond its silhouette. The figure stopped at the tent's entrance and crouched there, staring in. It didn't make a sound or move a muscle. Mr. K was paralyzed with fear, unable to act, as the creature remained still for what felt like 2 hours. The only sound was the occasional rustle of leaves in the breeze. He couldn't fathom what it was, and his mind raced as he wondered where his dog had gone. Finally, he heard the sound of his dog barking and running back toward the camp. The creature reacted instantly, leaping away with such speed and height that Mr. K couldn't track where it went. Within moments, his dog burst back into the tent, wagging its tail and seemingly unharmed. Shaken, Mr. K wasted no time packing up at first light. He vowed never to return to that area, and after hearing his story, I can't blame him. This is a story I've decided to share, though I'm not sure if I've sent it in before. To be safe, I'm submitting it again, and I've worked hard to ensure that all the people who were with me confirm the details I recall. Back in my senior year of high school, around 2017, my boyfriend invited me on a camping trip with 2 of our closest friends, Mia and Chris. I'm not a big fan of camping, but spending time with them made it worth it. We'd soon be graduating and going our separate ways, so I wanted to cherish these moments. One Friday afternoon, we stopped by a convenience store to stock up on snacks and drove to a wooded area near Hillside. The forest there had a bit of charm and mystery, making it a favorite spot for local campers. We set up camp about 10 minutes walk from Mia's car and spread out a blanket to play cards. As the night fell, Chris and I shared one tent, while Mia and our other friend, Riley, stayed in the other. Exhausted from the day, I quickly fell asleep. That night, I had an eerie dream. It felt as though I were some kind of creature, racing through the forest at an unnatural speed. It was as if I were viewing everything from above, like a bird or a drone. As I moved through the trees, I saw a faint orange glow ahead, our campfire. I felt compelled to rush toward it. The moment I got close, I snapped awake, drenched in sweat. Couldn't move and fear gripped me. I nudged Chris awake and whispered to him, "Something's out there." We sat in tense silence for a few minutes, listening to the night. Then we heard it, the sound of the zipper on our tent slowly being undone. I couldn't bring myself to look, but I heard it breathing harsh, ragged breaths that sent chills down my spine. Suddenly, a blaring police siren shattered the silence, and whatever was outside bolted into the darkness. We rushed out of the tent and found Mia and Riley doing the same. We scrambled into Mia's car, desperate for safety. Once inside, I asked, "What was that thing?" Riley, still shaken, described it to me. A tall, shadowy figure with a slim, almost animalistic frame. Its legs resembled those of a deer or horse, and its upper body was topped with a human-like head crowned by antlers. She then explained that she had used a police siren app on her phone to scare it off. Whatever it was, I'm glad Riley thought quickly and scared it away. If anyone has any ideas about what kind of creature might roam the forests of the Southeast, I'd love to hear your thoughts. This is the tale of my first and last time camping. I was 15 years old and my family, My mom, younger brother, and older sister had planned to spend the weekend camping with our aunt, uncle, and their 2 kids. It was our first real camping trip, while my cousins and their parents had gone on countless camping adventures before. The first day and evening went surprisingly smoothly. To my surprise, I actually had a lot of fun. But everything changed later that night, around 10 p.m. My cousins, sister, and I were settling into our shared tent, lying down on our makeshift sleeping area, when we heard the sound of footsteps outside the tent, circling around us. Startled, we sat up and noticed that whoever was outside seemed to be dragging something, possibly a stick, along the tent as they moved. At one point, my sister reached out and pressed her hand against the fabric of the tent, only to feel someone's leg through it. We knew it wasn't our mom, as her steps were light and her breathing distinctive. It wasn't my little brother either. He was just 6 years old at the time, and these footsteps were clearly those of an adult. Our cousins guessed it might be their dad, who often played pranks during camping trips, especially at night. To confirm, we peeked out of the small tent window, a flap that gave us a clear view of the campsite. We looked toward the road that bordered our site and saw our aunt and uncle returning from the nearby restrooms. That's when it hit us. Whoever was outside circling the tent wasn't part of our family. It was a complete stranger, and all that separated us from them was a thin layer of fabric. As our aunt and uncle got closer to the campsite, we shouted for them to come to the tent and explained what had happened. The footsteps stopped as soon as they arrived, and we assumed the stranger must have fled. While my cousins and sister were understandably shaken, I was too tired to fully process the situation or feel scared at the time. We spent the rest of the weekend as planned, and although I tried to enjoy myself, the unsettling incident stayed in the back of my mind. The most frustrating part of it all was that no one believed us afterward. Our mom, aunt, and uncle brushed it off, laughing and saying we were just letting our imaginations run wild. They even teased us, claiming we were spooked because of our love for creepy stories, conspiracy theories, and urban legends. Even now, I still think about that night. I wonder who that person was and what their intentions might have been. I also can't help but imagine what could have happened if our aunt and uncle hadn't returned when they did. None of us would have been able to defend ourselves. We were just teenage girls. That experience turned me off camping for good. I don't see myself ever going back. This was back in 2002 when a buddy of mine invited me on a camping trip. I hadn't gone camping since I was around 10, so I jumped at the chance. The idea had me buzzing all week, and I hardly slept the night before out of excitement. He picked me up bright and early, just after 6 a.m., and we drove about 120 miles to the park. I managed to doze off during the ride, so I felt a bit refreshed when we arrived. That's when he hit me with the surprise we still had a 2-hour hike to the campsite. I tried to convince him to pick a closer spot, but he insisted this one was worth it. Reluctantly, I followed. The first 30 minutes weren't too bad since most of it was downhill. But as time dragged on, so did I. We paused for a short break halfway there, but before long, we were back on the trail. The second stretch was brutal, mostly uphill, and it didn't take long for me to feel exhausted. I wasn't paying much attention to where I was stepping, and that's when it happened. We reached a flat section, and I thought I'd finally catch a break, but my friend walked ahead, somehow missing a hidden trap. I wasn't so lucky. One moment I was trudging along, and the next, I hit the ground. The impact jolted me awake, and adrenaline dulled most of the pain. When I tried to stand, my right ankle gave out, and I collapsed onto a jagged stick protruding from the bottom of the hole. Apparently, several stakes had been knocked over, but one remained upright. Looking down, I realized with horror that the bone in my shin was sticking out. Instinctively, I yanked the stick from my leg, which only worsened the pain and made me feel even dizzier. Gazing up, I could see nothing but blue sky framed by trees. The hole was about 9 or 10 feet deep. It must have taken whoever dug it days to finish. I called out for my friend, and soon his shocked face appeared above me. At first, he laughed, not realizing how serious my injuries were. But when I explained, his laughter turned to panic. He guessed that hunters or poachers had set up a trap, and I'd fallen into it. He tried to pull me out by reaching down, but that didn't work. Then he found a sturdy branch and used it to help me climb. But the moment I put weight on my injured leg, the pain was unbearable. I wasn't getting out without help. It was still early in the day, so I wasn't too worried. I told him to go find a ranger station, which was about an hour's walk away. He promised to return as quickly as possible and took off. Left alone, I had nothing but pain and my thoughts for company. Waves of agony came with nausea, and I realized I couldn't even make a proper splint. The pain was too intense. I decided to leave it alone and sat quietly, trying to keep calm. At first, I distracted myself by singing, but that didn't last. Thunder rumbled overhead, and the sky darkened. Light rain soon turned into a downpour. At first, I thought getting wet wouldn't be a big deal, but then I noticed water pooling at the bottom of the hole. Panic crept in as the water rose, submerging my feet. I clawed at the walls and tried to stand as best as I could. The rain only grew heavier, and within an hour, the water reached halfway up my shins. When the storm momentarily eased, I felt a glimmer of hope, but it was short-lived as the rain returned with a vengeance. I tried to stay positive, thinking about jokes and happy memories, but every minute dragged on. By the time help arrived, the rain had almost stopped, and the water level was just below my waist. The thought of drowning in that hole still sends chills down my spine. The rescuers lowered a rope and pulled me out. The ride to the hospital passed in a blur. After surgery, where they put in some screws and plates, I was sent home. The next 2 months on crutches were slow and frustrating, but I was grateful to be alive. We never got the chance to redo that camping trip, but I've taken my kids on a few since then. Maybe it's time to give my old buddy a call. It's been years since we've caught up, and a camping trip might be just what we need. This time, though, I'll keep a much closer eye on where I'm stepping. We had plans to go camping, but let me explain how I ended up in the worst situation of my life. At the time, I was 18 years old and going through a rebellious phase. I was dating questionable guys, lying to my family, and nearly getting myself killed. I started seeing a guy I thought was the one. We were from a rural part of the Midwest, so one evening we drove to a scenic spot and camped out. His family was wealthy. He lived in a huge house, and his father was a high-profile attorney. I felt like I had struck gold, but slowly the manipulation, narcissism, and abusive tendencies emerged. I tried to break up with him multiple times. The last time, he made threats against my family. He had never met my parents or been to my home. I'm very private about introducing people to my family, but he sent me my home address and my parents' full names. At 18, I was naive and terrified. He demanded I come to his family's lake house, so I lied to my parents, saying I was going on a weekend trip with a friend, and made the 6-hour drive to his place. I thought it was the only way to protect my family. When I arrived, things escalated immediately. Over the next 36 hours, I was subjected to unimaginable abuse. My hands were tied, and I was forced to sleep in my own vomit and urine. He cut me with small, deliberate slices across my arms, legs, and stomach. At some point, I accepted that I wouldn't make it out alive. My parents thought I was with a trusted friend and her family. They had no reason to suspect otherwise. He was out of his mind, injecting drugs and snorting cocaine. At one point, he started laughing and snorting it off the cuts on my skin. My emotions shut down entirely. I cried without feeling anything. Then came the worst moment. He loaded a single bullet into a revolver, spun the chamber, and forced it into my mouth. As he laughed, I looked him directly in the eyes and told him to pull the trigger. I even bit down on the barrel. He pulled the trigger, but it clicked, no bullet. I didn't flinch. Something about my reaction snapped him back to reality. He started sobbing, apologizing, and untying me. He cried in my lap for hours, but I felt nothing. I didn't care if I survived anymore. I know you're wondering, did I call the police? At the time, I didn't. I was ashamed and didn't want my parents to find out. They trusted me, and I couldn't bear the thought of them knowing what had happened. Plus, his father was an excellent lawyer, and I felt powerless. I drove home, battered and broken. Thankfully, it was winter, so I could hide my injuries with long sleeves and heavy clothes. I told my family and friends I had flipped a four-wheeler. A believable excuse because I'd had accidents like that before. The story doesn't completely end there. I cut off all contact with him and blocked him everywhere. Since he lived in a nearby town, we didn't cross paths at school. However, he still tried to reach me using fake accounts. Even now, at 24 years old, I occasionally receive messages from him. Later, he was arrested for dealing hard drugs, not just marijuana, something much worse. Despite his father's influence, he still served some time. He ended up in a rehabilitation facility but managed to escape, leading to a brief manhunt. Today, I'm married, living in a different state, and doing my best to move forward. However, what happened during that horrific weekend left deep scars. I'm on medication to manage my anxiety and triggers. I've developed quirks. I always stay slightly hungry to keep myself alert and work out obsessively to feel strong. My body and mind are stuck in survival mode. I've accepted that some of these effects will never go away. The summer of 2010 was a tough period to graduate from college. I had just spent 4 years earning a degree only to find the job market practically non-existent. As disappointed as I was about being unemployed for the foreseeable future, I discovered a profound appreciation for wilderness camping and trekking during that time. Growing up in the Sierra Nevada mountains and graduating from a university in eastern Idaho, I was no stranger to hiking or camping. However, that summer, it became a much-needed escape to the point of obsession. Daily hikes and nights under the open sky became my therapy, while I grappled with questions about my life's direction and purpose. It was June, and the weather was unusually chilly, damp, and overcast. Daytime temperatures barely reached 50 degrees Fahrenheit, and at night, they dipped below freezing. Despite the dreary conditions, I planned to explore Ridgewood Trail that week and wasn't about to let the weather deter me. My route for the week included Frost Lake, climbing Frost Lake Pass, and descending toward Cedar Basin. Frost Lake is actually an alpine reservoir, not a natural lake. Reaching it requires a four-wheel drive vehicle and some skillful maneuvering. The access road winds through dense pine forest, slick with rain. Although the path was a challenge, I managed to reach the lake with minimal trouble. I pitched my tent on the northern shore and decided to do some fishing. The fishing was terrible, cold, wet, and fruitless. But the one benefit of lousy fishing is the space it gives your mind to wander. While I sat on the shoreline in the constant drizzle, the sound of rain created a soothing white noise. My daydreams were abruptly interrupted by a low, steady rumble echoing from up the canyon. The noise resembled the distant hum of a large engine, perhaps a diesel. However, there were no roads beyond the lake, no machinery, and no vehicles that could be up there. Maybe it was a plane, I thought, glancing up at the rain-heavy clouds. But the sound wasn't coming from above. It originated somewhere deeper in the canyon. The rumble was stationary and unchanging. This certainly wasn't a plane, truck, or bulldozer. Though it wasn't overtly frightening, the sound made my skin crawl. After about 20 minutes, the noise faded, leaving only the rain. I caught a decent-sized trout shortly after and returned to camp to prepare dinner. I cooked the fish, though I'm not fond of trout. They taste earthy and unappealing to me. I ate what I could and tossed the rest into the lake. As the evening deepened, I built up the fire and settled in with a small bottle of whiskey. The sun set early behind the mountain ridges, and the cloud cover obscured the stars, leaving me in near total darkness. The sounds of the crackling fire and rain on my tent began to lull me into a light doze. But before crawling into my sleeping bag, I remembered to stoke the fire. Walking to the firewood pile, I suddenly noticed the rumbling sound again. This time it was louder and closer. Having had a bit too much whiskey, I was annoyed rather than scared. The noise was ruining my peaceful night. Without thinking, I yelled into the void, "Knock it off, you idiot!" Immediately, the rumbling ceased. So did the rain. My heart skipped a beat. The abrupt silence was no coincidence. It felt as if something intelligent out there had heard me and responded. I quickly piled more logs onto the fire and retreated to my tent, heart racing. As I sat there listening to the crackling flames and my own rapid breathing, the oppressive silence beyond the firelight weighed on me. It felt like countless eyes were watching from the darkness. Just as my paranoia reached its peak, the rain started again, this time as a torrential downpour. The storm battered my tent, and water began pooling beneath it. I contemplated making a dash for my truck, but hesitated, knowing the muddy trail was treacherous. Eventually, I decided that sleeping in the truck was safer than staying in the fragile tent. I grabbed what I could and sprinted through the rain to the truck. Once inside, I cranked up the heater and locked the doors. Exhausted, damp, and slightly drunk, I reclined the seat and tried to calm my nerves. The fire outside still burned brightly, casting a reassuring glow over the campsite. Glancing at the clock, I noted it was 10:06 p.m. I blinked, and suddenly it was dawn. The clock now read 5:45 a.m., but it felt as if only a moment had passed. My head throbbed, and I couldn't remember drinking enough to warrant such a severe hangover. The storm had subsided, and a thick fog blanketed the area. I surveyed the damage. My tent was flattened, its poles shattered. Everything was soaked. Frustrated and unnerved, I quickly packed up my gear and loaded it into the truck. As I climbed into the driver's seat, I heard the rumbling once more, faint but unmistakable. I didn't look back as I sped down the muddy road. I've never returned to Frost Lake, and I don't intend to. When I was around 17, my buddy and I went on a camping trip to a place called Pinewood Camp. Even now, years later, I still can't shake off the unsettling memories of that trip. The moment we arrived at the campsite, something didn't feel quite right. It was as if unseen eyes were watching us. Deep scratches marked the picnic tables and nearby trees, as though a wild animal or something worse had gone on a rampage. Despite the unease, I helped my friend pitch his tent, trying to push those thoughts aside and focus on enjoying the day. That evening, as we were settling in, I finally told my friend about the strange marks I'd seen earlier. He looked at me like I was imagining things, brushing it off as my overactive imagination. Then, out of nowhere, we heard a blood-curdling screech coming from the depths of the woods. It didn't sound human. It was like a cry from some nightmare. Terrified, we clung to each other, hearts pounding. Summoning what little courage we had, we decided to step out of the tent to investigate the noise. Armed with pocket knives and flashlights, supplied by our parents for emergencies, we headed toward the sound. In hindsight, I don't know what we thought we could do with those knives, but at the time, it made us feel braver. We walked about 40 or 50 yards into the woods before we heard the screech again, much louder this time. It felt like it was only about 10 yards away. My hands were trembling as I gripped my knife. My friend, in his nervousness, accidentally dropped his knife, and we couldn't find it in the darkness. Whatever was out there with us, it was far beyond anything we could handle. Suddenly, the sound of snapping branches and rustling leaves erupted just ahead of us. Instinct took over, and we started running toward the noise, thinking we'd find answers. But when we shone our flashlights ahead, we froze. Standing there was something. It looked vaguely human, but it was covered in blood. Its sunken, glowing yellow eyes glared at us, and its mouth was filled with sharp, needle-like teeth. Before we could fully process what we were seeing, the creature let out a guttural growl and started charging at us. Without hesitation, we turned and bolted back toward the campsite. My lungs burned, and my legs felt like jelly, but we didn't stop running until we reached my friend's truck. As if out of a bad horror movie, the truck wouldn't start right away. Panic set in as we fumbled with the keys, but eventually, the engine roared to life, and we sped off down the dirt road. As we drove away, I glanced back toward the woods. Those glowing yellow eyes were still watching us from the tree line, burning into my memory. That thing was tall and unnaturally thin. To this day, I can't explain what we encountered, but if anyone else has had a similar experience, I'd love to hear about it. Please share your stories below.